So for me, why I am a scientist is because I'm a mystic. And I don't mean that I entered into science to try to answer mystical problems, although it turns out maybe some of my work has some bearing on that. What I mean is a mystic does the same thing that a scientist does, in my view, which is to be inspired, have something evoked in you in a way that you don't understand. Then follow it and see where it leads and walk blindly and experience what you experience as the answer to that. And then to share what you've found. Right? That is exactly what a mystic does, and that's what a scientist is supposed to do. Right? I have an idea for an experiment. Do I know where that comes from? No, I do not. Do I do the experiment? Yes, I do. And then I see what happens, and then I share it, and then I have another question that comes in the middle of the night or when I'm taking a shower, and then I follow that. It's a beautiful dance with the universe. So the scientific quest and the mystical quest, to me, are the same thing, and they're just using slightly different tools, but even the tools aren't that different. It's all observation, it's all inspiration, and it's all communication.
All right. Somebody left me a comment in the last video I made on AI and the cybernetic collective and everything. Left a link to this talk given by Ben Goertzel and this woman named Julia Mossbridge. And they're talking about more of the same thing in terms of how do we design an AI that can love? How do you teach it unconditional love and create the AI that embodies the new age concept of love, of course? And it's pretty interesting. I mean, it's not the talk itself is just kind of more of the same stuff, and the audio's not even very good. It's like it was recorded on somebody's phone or something. But it prompted me to start looking into this Julia Mossbridge character, and she's pretty interesting. She's involved in a lot of stuff. She's a neuroscientist. She has a PhD, but at the same time, she's super deep into the whole consciousness realm, right? This talk that she did with Ben Goertzel last year in 2017 was sponsored by this Hacking Consciousness organization, and they have like a conference every year, and based out of San Francisco, of course, and also by the Institute of Noetic Sciences. Surprise, surprise. And she was actually, for a long time, the director of the Innovation Lab for Institute of Noetic Sciences. And if you don't, I've talked about that before, if you're not familiar, that was founded, I think, in the 70s by Edgar Mitchell, who, of course, was the astronaut turned psychonaut. He claims to have had this transcendent experience when he was in space and returning from space, to where he felt, unified with everything, and he had his mystical experience in space, which is interesting, of course, in light of all the stuff I've been talking about for a long time, exploring the ideas of, what are the connections between space and the space hoax, and how that is some sort of occult metaphor or some sort of representation of hyperdimensional spiritual realms and all that. So, noetic sciences, right? Been around for a long time. And this innovation lab that she was a part of, I mean, they've got a lot of stuff on their website in terms of all these different links and resources pointing people to different examples of technology being used to expand consciousness and, help you meditate, help you do all these things. So of course it's, again, all about this convergence between technology and New Age spirituality. So that incorporates AI, that incorporates all the other, scientific disciplines and psychology and neuroscience and all these things. And she's got the clip that was at the beginning there. That was one of those little blurb videos that they put out where they talk for a few minutes by that SAND organization, Science and Non-Duality, which I've talked about before also. So it's all these familiar organizations, familiar names. Mossbridge actually has her own institute, the Mossbridge Institute. It's like everybody has an institute. And she's been involved with a lot of different companies and organizations, and she's pretty busy. And she's, as that clip shows, she's openly talking about how mysticism and science are really far more similar than a lot of conventional scientists want to admit. So she's kind of on the forefront of pushing that discussion and talking, and she goes into depth about how, in a different video, about how neuroscientists and mystics, they're both very interested in the whole concept of consciousness, but a lot of times they're kind of coming at it from opposite angles, and she's kind of trying to help bridge that gap and facilitate that discussion. And she actually uses this illustration of two trees that are seemingly separate, but their roots are commingled.
So there's a little bit of a language problem between the world of neuroscientists on the one hand and the world of mystics and then on the other hand. But we need to go back to the roots of experimental psychology and neuroscience. So William James, who's a wonderful neuroscientist and experimental psychologist, and he said, look, you have trees, their roots connect, they commingle underneath the earth, and at the top, they're separate. And so our conscious experiences of being separate and our unconscious, he calls it because he's an experimental psychologist, is of being connected. And both of those things are true, and it depends on perspective. And I think that's the closest we can get to any kind of understanding between those two communities.
So yeah, she's trying to say that they're seemingly separate and kind of using different terminologies and different perspectives, but really it's all doing the same thing. So in a lot of ways, of course, this is exactly what I've been trying to say, and now it's like they are saying it, they are pushing it more and more all the time. So it's always interesting when you find examples of that where it's just, you don't have to read between the lines. It's very out in the open. But as I was thinking about all this, going back to the whole science and non-duality, just that name alone, it kind of made me stop and think about how, there's been so many things over the years that have helped give me insight and help kind of serve as building blocks to kind of form the lens and the paradigm that now, as I'm looking at all this stuff and talking about all this stuff, to be able to kind of break it down and understand it and get to sort of the philosophical and theological roots of it, rather than just dealing with things on a surface level. And this totally reminded me of something that years ago I heard for the first time, and heard many times as I was listening to Ravi Zacharias when he had a radio show, probably still does, but he had a radio show and they would just do little excerpts from his talks, because basically he just travels around and gives lectures and seminars, and then they have Q&A time. That's sort of a big part of what he does is Q&A, and he's just one of my favorite apologists, Christian apologists of all time. I've learned a lot from him, but one of the most, I think, pivotal things that I ever listened to that has stuck with me over the years and has really gone a long ways in helping me really understand what I'm seeing now in terms of this whole agenda pushing monism, pantheism, New Age spirituality, and how that now is merging into technology, and all these things are just kind of coming together, is where he talks about the law of non-contradiction. And I'm just going to play this clip. It's about 7 minutes, but seriously, if you can kind of wrap your head around what he's talking about and get to the core of this, it will be immensely helpful to you. Because we are now facing exactly what he is talking about more and more and more in all these different spaces and all these different arenas, in terms of non-duality and sort of the monistic New Age perspective. So I'm going to play this and then expound, of course, at the end.
Here is the law of logic as it applies to reality. I remember speaking, please bear with me for those of you familiar with this illustration, but it is the most incisive one that I can give to you. I remember speaking in one of the United States western cities when one of the professors was attending the lectureship and asked me to speak against an Eastern religion, which I said I would not do. He said, I'm an American, I belong to that other Eastern religion, let's just call it X. And he said, and I have taught this X religion in my lectures and so on. I want you to speak on the subject why you do not subscribe to the dogma of religion X. And my students will take you apart after your lecture. I said, no, I really don't want to do that. I said, I've learned when you throw mud at others, not only do you get your hands dirty, but you also lose a lot of ground. And he accepted that. I said, but I will tell you why I am a Christian. I will speak on that subject. At the end of the talk, he was quite vociferous in his denunciation of what I'd said, and he basically took me to task at the front of the lecture room, attacking the fact that I didn't understand logic and so on. I said, look, we're not going to get anywhere. Let's go out for lunch. You pay, and I'll pray, and we'll get together. So we got together for lunch, and he brought a professor of psychology with him, and the psychologist and I finished our lunch while the philosopher hadn't even started his. His food had become congealed in front of him. And he had taken off these paper placemats of all the tables to draw out his argument. And basically what he was trying to say was this, that there are two kinds of logic. Actually, he was wrong. There are more. But he said there are two kinds of logic. One is the law of non-contradiction. The law of non-contradiction means if something is true, the opposite of it is false. If something is true, the opposite of it is false. It is called an either-or logic. If I say to you, for example, there is a red car parked immediately outside the steps there, if that statement is true, the opposite of it is false. I am not at the same time saying that red car is not parked out there. It is either true or false. I've just given you a simple illustration. If it is A, then it is not non-A at the same time. You basically establish the either-or dogma. And he says, Ravi, that is the law of non-contradiction, that is either-or, that is a Western way of thinking. Westerners think either-or. I said, I disagree with the last statement. Why don't you rub it off? He wouldn't do it. So then he moved to the Eastern way of thinking. He said, in the East, you do both and. It is a dialectic. You don't say either this or that. You say both this and that. Karl Marx used the dialectical system. It was not either the employer or the employee. You put them together and you find a classless society. Both employer and employee join together in a classless society. Funny thing, they never show you one, but they talk about it. That there is a both and dogma in the dialectic, two poles of an argument there. And he says, you see, Ravi, he said, the dialectical system is Eastern. The dialectical system is Eastern. And I said, why don't you cross out that last line? Because I don't agree with you, but he refused to cross it out. What he was trying to say was this. I had talked about the many contradictions in certain pantheistic worldviews, very strong contradictions. And he said, you see, Ravi, if you took the dialectical system to be true, anytime you came into a contradiction, you won't be puzzled by it. You'll say, this is the way they think. They make opposite statements, and both of them are right. So if you ask one follower of religion X, is God personal? He says yes. You ask a second follower of religion X, is God personal? And he says no. You go to the third person and say, which of these two is right? And he says, both of them. He says that's an Eastern way of thinking. So you've got the either or, which is Western, the both and, which is Eastern. And he was waxing eloquent on this, going on and on and on. Finally, I said, can I say something to you, sir? He said yes, and he picked up his knife and fork and started to cut into his first morsel of food. And as he was cutting into the morsel of food, I said, here's what you've told me. There is an either-or, which is Western. There is a both-and, which is Eastern, and you want me to study religion X, right? Now, here's my question to you, doctor. Are you telling me when I'm studying religion X, I either use the both-and system or nothing else? Is that right? That I either use the both-hand system or nothing else, is that right? Do you know what he did? He put his knife and fork down, and with a very nervous expression, I wish I had the cameras there to film it, He says to me, the either or does seem to emerge, doesn't it? I said, yes, in fact, I've got some shocking news for you. Even in India, we look both ways before we cross the street. It is either the bus or me, not both of us. Do you see what he was doing? He was using the either or with which to prove the both and. He was telling me I either use this system or nothing else. And he was staggered to realize that he used it every day. So it's got nothing to do whether it's Western or whether it's Eastern. It's got everything to do with that which best reflects reality. And when Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, no man comes unto the Father but by me, it is a most reasonable statement. The question is it true? It is a most reasonable statement because truth, by definition, is exclusive. The moment you affirm something, you exclude anything that challenges that. And the way you prove the law of non-contradiction is that by just talking, and if anyone else stands up and challenges you against it, by challenging you, they are proving you right. That it is either what you're saying or what they're saying. Now, the Easterner understands this malady. That's why the Easterner says, when the mouth opens, all are fools. But the problem is his mouth opens to tell us that. Or as one of the famous mystics said, he who knows does not speak. He who speaks does not know. Well, did he speak? And if he spoke, then he does not know. And if he does not know, does it really matter if he spoke? The law of non-contradiction must apply to reality. If you deny the law of non-contradiction, you may as well talk about a one-ended stick. It cannot even be pictured, leave alone stated. Because the opposite poles are very much in your mind of an either or there. Now, it is therefore more logically possible that all the religions in the world are wrong, but it is not logically sensible to say that all the religions in the world are right.
It's either the bus or me, not both. I love that part. It's great. Such a great way of exposing sort of the hypocrisy there. But as the guy he was talking to said, the either or does seem to emerge, doesn't it? And that's so key because, okay, so even just thinking about this SAND organization, science and non-duality, just think about the term itself, non-duality. And essentially that's just another way of describing monism. So it's about, science and monism, or science and mysticism, science and Eastern spirituality, right? So they chose non-duality and, makes the acronym SAND, but non-duality is kind of hilarious to me because just that alone, that in itself is a perfect example of what Ravi was just talking about, to where you're using the either or logic to try and deny the either or. Non-duality, so duality is what they're rejecting. We're non-duality, but if it's non, it's a negation. It's not that. That, like, duality is wrong. But you're using a dualistic statement to try and deny dualism. It's a negation, it's a distinction. But supposedly there are no negations and distinctions because everything is one. So it just cracks me up because, this is the whole thing of just embracing the contradiction, embracing the both and. That's supposedly like the height of, what's so profound about mysticism, right? Is be able to embrace things that seem to contradict, but then they don't. Is God personal or impersonal? Well, they're both right, So you make that whole question and those terms meaningless. And as I was thinking about all this, of course, I was going back to the whole issue of quantum physics and quantum computing, and specifically how quantum computing is all based around this concept, this core concept from quantum theory dealing with superposition, right? When we talk about particle wave duality and using the wave function to chart how supposedly you can only deal with where the particle or the electron might be at any given time in terms of probabilities, but you don't really know exactly where it is until you look. And this is also expressed with this thought experiment. I love how quantum physics always deals with thought experiments. But the Schrodinger's cat, right? This is what Schrodinger's cat is supposed to help illustrate is this idea that you have this box and there's like poisonous gas that can go off, but you don't know if the cat is alive until you open the box. So until you open the box, the cat is supposedly in a state of superposition where it's both alive and dead, which of course is ridiculous because the cat can't be alive and dead, but only because you don't know, so somehow that means that it's both at the same time. It's, and again, another example of the both and contradiction being embraced and then being used in now this scientific way, where this is the reason that they're saying that quantum computing is going to be able to be so much more exponentially powerful and can solve problems faster and everything else, is because it doesn't rely on typical ones, binary logic, binary computing. That is how transistors and everything. So the qubit, supposedly, instead of being on or off, either a 1 or a 0, allegedly it can be 1 and 0 at the same time. And then when you put string qubits together, it somehow improves your computing power exponentially rather than linearly. And, of course, quantum computing ties into artificial intelligence because they're saying that once we really get reliable quantum computing hardware and everything, that's just going to propel the AI research and development just at an exponential rate. And yeah, once that line is crossed, or once they start actually coming out with that and saying that that's what they've accomplished, then I do imagine that things could start to change really fast, or really, really take off, even faster than they are already. And we're right on the cusp of this. They're talking about it so much. And there's many different companies working on this, and you have this whole AI tech race between the US and China that they keep talking about. But that to me is I was thinking about it with just superposition itself. This quantum concept of superposition is again another example of what is an ancient tenet of mysticism, of mystical ideology that has now been encouched in quote-unquote scientific terms and scientific application, which really should make us pause as believers in the Bible. And yes, we want to affirm that there is legitimate science versus pseudoscience, and this ties into all the things I've been talking about with quantum mysticism and Christians kind of being oblivious to really like how deep the deception really could go. Because just on its face, you have to embrace the both and in order to believe that this is a legit scientific understanding of, the quantum world, and B, that the things that they're now claiming to build and be able to do in terms of quantum computing is just everything that it seems to be at face value. When in reality, obviously we know that at the core of mysticism and all things New Age and occult is spiritual deception, that there are real sentient, ancient spiritual beings who are guiding the whole thing and seducing people and deceiving people from the spiritual realm, using these false teachings, using these practices in order to draw them into deeper and deeper lies. And that this is essentially where the mystery religion is going. This is the one world religion that is spreading in the name of science and spreading in the name of unity and tolerance and all these things, unconditional love. And that's another one where, when you really break it down, when you understand when people in the world, and specifically people who are openly embracing New Age spirituality, they love to talk about, love and light and unconditional love. And that's a big thing that Mossbridge talks about in terms of AI. It's about unconditional love. How do you teach it? And everyone is kind of conditioned to respond positively to that idea of unconditional love. That's something that it sounds great. We all want to be loved unconditionally. And it's, again, this ties back into the either or versus the both and in terms of what is love and this concept of unconditional love. Right? Because it's one thing to say that we all want unconditional love, because love shouldn't be something that you're trying to earn, to try and be good enough, try and jump through enough hoops in order to be good enough to be loved by someone. And then if you mess up or you fail, that the love is taken away. We understand that love doesn't work like that. And that God's love is patient and kind and grace, and that you could describe God's love as unconditional love. Even while we were sinners, God loved us. He didn't wait until we were good enough, because that was never going to happen. But At the same time, biblical love, Christian love, is not unconditional love in the same sense that the world and the New Age spirituality would make it out to. Because there are conditions for what is love and what is not. And there are moral definitions and moral laws that define what love is. And you can spurn God's love like you can spurn someone else's love. And even if you are being loved by God and not loving him back, that situation doesn't represent some just perfect ongoing scenario of a loving relationship. There's still a brokenness. So God's unconditional love, God's mercy, God's grace is just beyond comprehension, and it's just unimaginable. But at the same time, we are called to repentance. We are called to go to the cross, and that's why God can come to us with grace and mercy, is because he dealt with our broken conditions. He dealt with our sin. He dealt with our rebellion. Whereas in the New Age spirituality, unconditional love just means, you just love everyone. You don't ask them to do anything. You don't ask them to change. You just love, 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 love. Everything is love. And the irony is that people latch onto that as this appealing idea because it just sounds so wonderful and tolerant and compassionate and all these words that you hear them use. But really, there's no lines anywhere. So their version of unconditional love, just like how pantheism just takes over everything and encompasses everything, even the things that are the most evil, wicked things going on in the world and the most horrific atrocities that human beings do to other human beings, that's all just God interacting with God, right? So you can't even call it evil at the end of the day. Those are meaningless terms. The whole concept of unconditional love is, again, one of these both and fallacies. Because basically you're saying that everything that everyone does is love, right? And that's being enlightened, is just understanding that everything is love and hate is an illusion. And so in reality, you're just validating everything. And this is kind of what Buddhism is all about. It's just about removing yourself from the tension, removing yourself from caring, removing yourself from trying to make those distinctions and reacting to them and reacting to things that are wrong in the world, and just, achieving nirvana, achieving enlightened bliss by just becoming ambivalent to everything and just embracing the both and. But nobody can really live like that. I've never met anyone who wakes up in the morning and goes about their day and just, no matter what anyone does, it's all love, man. It's all good when, at the end of the day. There's no such thing as right or wrong. Because otherwise you're putting a condition on somebody. So you can't ever have an issue with anything anyone does or says or believes, because unconditional love, don't put conditions on it, which, again, non-duality. Well, you're rejecting duality, so that's not unconditional love, is it? So again, the either or does seem to emerge no matter what. And when you're talking to people, whether they're really into New Age spirituality or they're just, your typical materialistic atheist, this is really where everyone kind of gets caught in their own trap. If you're trying to talk about the Bible and share truth with them, and they start giving you, whatever their pet arguments against God and the Bible are, this is where you can so easily and quickly just get down to the core of how they contradict their own position. Because the materialistic atheist still is embracing the both and they will appeal to an objective morality in order to try and deny the existence of objective morality. They always do this. They will try and appeal to that there is some sort of higher purpose or design or intention, the way that human beings are supposed to be or not supposed to be, in order to defend the idea that there is no design, that it's all an accident, that we're all just, evolved from the Big Bang. The New Agers will appeal to objective truth in order to deny objective truth. Flying right in the face of the law of non-contradiction every time. You can't live in the world without saying that if this is A, then A is not non-A. If I'm telling you that the red car is parked outside, then I'm not also telling you that it's not parked outside. All of language, all of human interaction, all of relationships, and everything you do in any arena of life relies upon distinctions, relies upon non-contradictory logic relies upon the either or, not the both and. Because then I could just say anything and everything, and it could just be word soup, and you'd have to embrace it as just as valid as anything else I might say or do. Oh yeah, boss, I went to work today, but I also didn't go to work today. See how far that gets you. Either your car has gas in it or it doesn't, not both. And the answer is going to determine how far you can drive that day. This is so basic stuff, and yet, when you put it in this realm of mind-blowing quantum physics and all this just crazy technology where they're claiming to cool these quantum particles down to almost absolute zero so that they can stay in their quantum state and it's like the whole idea is just to make it so intimidating that, like, how could you question it? Look at all the hardware, look at all the engineering that has gone into this, all the years and all these PhDs, and yeah, it's very intimidating. I couldn't even write computer code that would be useful in 1985, let alone break down the technicalities of what they're doing at D-Wave and all these places. But I can stop and look at something as basic as a concept of superposition and see that now this is a logical contradiction that you are trying to get people to embrace in order to then build everything else on top of it. And so that's where I think if you boil it down to that and draw a line there and say, no, let's look at this a little closer, then I think that is a very valid place to stop and try and discern what might really be going on. Because, yeah, now it's one thing to look back at John Bell and all these the physicists of the early 20th century, and then all this, it's all cold, hard science, right? But now you see where it's all going. You see what it's all turned into. You see what quantum computing and artificial intelligence are all now merging into this consciousness spirituality, occult spirituality that transcends different cultures, transcends national boundaries, transcends, religious distinctions through the guise of technology, through the guise of science. Man, you can see where all this is going. So maybe we need to stop and think about, like, what are the philosophical contradictions and the lies that have been snuck in order to make that possible? How did we get here? So just wanted to share that. That's one of my favorite Ravi Zacharias illustrations, and it has helped me immensely. So, and you see this contradiction of people trying to push the both and, but still actually, you have to appeal to the either or in order to push anything. In order to argue for anything, you have to use the either or. You have to make those distinctions. You have to employ the law of non-contradiction to say anything meaningful in any way. So, hopefully that makes sense. Thanks for watching. God bless.
These go to 11.